Welcome to Exegetical Tools Basic Greek videos. In this video we're going to look at the future active indicative, and we're going to assume that you've probably already watched the present active indicative videos and you have that paradigm down pretty well, because the future active indicative is going to basically build on that paradigm. In a sense, they are distinct paradigms, but you could think of it as the future basically building on the present, because it's really just going to add what we're going to call a tense formative, and it's going to have a different stem. It's going to have the same connecting vowel and the same endings, and so it's actually going to look very similar to the present tense, basically with a sigma thrown in there. So hopefully you know the present active indicative pretty well at this point. So let's look first at the four constituent parts that make up the future active indicative. The first part is the future active tense stem. So this is a different stem from the present active tense stem. And in the case of luo, it's actually going to be the exact same, because luo is a very regular verb. But you do have other verbs where the stem will be different. So if you look down here, for example, you have the verb keruso, but the future tense stem is just going to be keruk. So you're going to add your endings to keruk, your tense form, your connecting vowel, and your endings. So there's one example. Another example that's pretty frequent is balo, which in the present tense, that's the stem in the present tense with two lambdas. When it goes into the future tense, it's just going to have one lambda. So there are quite a few verbs with different tense stems, and luo just happens to be quite regular. Now there's a tense formative, and what that's going to be is just a letter or a group of letters that are signaling a certain tense stem. In this case, the sigma is going to be signaling the future tense, and that gets inserted right before the connecting vowel. And then you are going to have the same connecting vowel as with the present active indicative, the omicron epsilon variable connecting vowel, and then you'll have the primary active personal endings. This is the same that we've seen with the present active indicative, and remember, you may recall that there are four sets of endings. If you think of it this way, there's the primary active, which is what we have here, the primary active endings. There's the secondary active, there's the primary middle and passive, and there's the secondary middle and passive, So there's four sets of endings. We're just still in the first set here. You saw with the present active indicative, this set of endings you saw, excuse me, not this one, but the primary middle passive endings you saw on the present middle passive indicative. So you've already seen both sets of primary endings. We'll eventually get to the secondary endings later on. Now, as far as the form of the future tense goes, one other thing to note is that some verbs are deponent in some tense forms, but not in others. So take, for example, estheo, which means I am eating in the present tense, present active indicative. When you put it in the future, if you want to say I will eat, you're going to have a completely different word, so you're going to have a different root right here, and then you're also going to have this deponent ending. So it's a passive form, my, middle or passive, but it's active in meaning, and so that means it's deponent. So it's not deponent in the present tense, it's just normal active. But when you go to the future, it's the active sense is expressed as a deponent verb, phagamai. So that's one of those you probably just want to memorize as a vocabulary word, because otherwise you just wouldn't be able to recognize it. It's completely different, and it's deponent. Okay, now when it comes to translating the future tense, one thing to note is that it's generally going to be simply future tense. It's pretty much always going to be future tense, and it can have different senses. It can be simply expressing the future time, like he will go to the store. It can have a sense of possibility. It can have a sense of duty, and sometimes it can just have a sense of command, basically. So look at Matthew 5:43 down here. You shall love your neighbor. That's a sense of either command or duty, something you must do. But other times it's simply just the future time. Now the future tense form is always cast into the future time, and it's perhaps the only tense form in Koine Greek that does not have any aspect to it. Remember the difference between time and aspect. Time is simply when the action actually occurs, whereas aspect is the way that the speaker is presenting the action subjectively from his point of view. So you can have an internal perspective to the action as if you're within the action itself as you're saying it. You can have an external viewpoint on the action. But with the future tense stem, it seems like there may or may not be any aspectual force. Grammarians are uncertain about this. If you want to read more about it, you can look up the chapters on the future tense stem in various grammars, such as Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, or Robertson's, A.T. Robertson's grammar as well. Or you can do some reading on verbal aspect, which those discussions will talk about the future tense stem a lot, and you can find some books on that on our annotated bibliography on verbal aspect on our website. Now, there are some, when it comes to the frequency of the future tense, it's mostly limited to the indicative mood. There are some infinitives and participles, for example, in Luke's writings, Hebrews, but even these are pretty rare. And even within the future, within the New Testament itself, or Koine Greek, the future indicative is rarer than it could be. Like it could be more present than it is, but the present participle and even the present indicative can express an imminent action in the future, just like it can in Hebrew and Aramaic. So you can have something like the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect, erikatai, but you would translate that as the Son of Man will come. So it's expressing the imminence of his coming, that he is coming at an hour you do not expect. But for that reason, there are fewer occurrences of the future tense than there would be otherwise, but it's still frequent enough that you need to know the paradigm pretty well, and you need to know the rules for the ways the forms can change, the kind of contractions that can occur and that sort of thing. So let's look at the paradigm now. You'll see the paradigm very similar to the present active indicative. You have, just going down the list here, looks like luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, luusi. Okay, but here it's luso, luses, luse, lusamen, lusite, and lususi, with a movable nu there on the end, lususin. Okay, so this is simply stem, tense formative, connecting vowel, and personal endings. The personal endings here, these are the actual personal endings before they're put together with the connecting vowels. And then over here are the endings after they're put together with the connecting vowels. As far as the translation, I've done a simple future tense translation. So luso means I will loose. It could mean I shall loose, or let's take the second person singular as a better example. You will loose could mean you, like a prediction, you will loose in the future, you will do something. It could be a duty, you will do this, or you shall loose. It could express some uncertainty or contingency, but as a default translation, something like I will loose, I will walk, I will eat. That's a fair default translation, and then you'll just need to see what the context is and how the verb is actually functioning in the context. Does it seem to have a progressive sense, like I will be loosing? Does it seem to have that sort of modal sense of duty? That's something you'll just have to get from the context. Now there are some contractions and some contractions that occur and some changes with the future forms whenever, especially with that tense formative, the sigma. So there's two things to know about the sigma and what it does to these forms. The first thing is with contract verbs. So a contract verb is going to have on the end of the stem, like agapao, it's going to end in a vowel like alpha, epsilon, omicron. And when that happens, and then when you add a sigma onto the end of that sigma is going to force a change with that final vowel of the stem. It's going to cause it to lengthen. So you see over here you had agapaso, that's the hypothetical form that you would get for the first person singular future. But then right here you see how that alpha has lengthened to an eta. So that's simple. With contract verbs, you get the contract vowel, the last vowel of the stem, lengthens before the tense formative. So that's the rule. This would be the wording to look at very carefully right here. So if you see a form and you see a long vowel that occurs right before a tense formative, and you know that vowel is different than the last letter of the lexical stem, then it's very likely that's future active indicative. Although other tense forms do exist that exhibit that same lengthening, so you can't simply assume it. But for example, if you see agape, and you know, and then you see a sigma, and you know that this is from agapao, but you see an eta, then this is very likely the future tense. So that's a good signal that you have the future tense on your hands. Lastly here, we'll look at the square of stops. So when the stem of a verb ends in a stop, and if you haven't seen the video on the square of stops, or if you don't recall it, you might want to go back and watch that video just to get a quick review on that, because we'll kind of assume some of that here, but I'll try to review it again as well. So a stop is either a labial, a velar, or a dental. And these are, so labials are P, beta, and phi. And then the velars are kappa, gamma, and chi. And the dentals are tau, delta, and theta. Those are the stops, because when you say them, you basically have to stop the air from going through your mouth as you're saying it, either by putting your tongue to your teeth or to your lips or whatever. So whenever these come before a sigma, there's going to be a contraction that occurs. So let's just look at some examples here. Let me clean this up because it's getting in my way. We have some examples. So for example, blepso. This is a form that you would get because this comes from blepo, right? This comes from blepo. Now, when you try to add the sigma in there to be a tense form, you would get blepso, but that p sigma is simply a labial plus a sigma, and so the resulting contraction is ipsi. So you get blepso. So it's pronounced the same, but it's spelled differently. But it's very important to remember that this occurs because whenever you see this form with the psi instead of sigma, you have to be able to recognize that there's a sigma tense formative in there. So you have to be able to recognize that this is basically equivalent to that. Blepso. Another example, instead of having dioxo, from dioko, I persecute or pursue, we get dioxo. So this is a kappa, which is a velar, and the velar plus a sigma is going to give you a xi. So here you have dioxo. Again, it's pronounced the exact same, but the letters are different. So you need to be able to spot that hidden sigma tense formative in there. And lastly, with a dental, like theta, you have patho, and instead of pathso, the dental is just going to drop out. So if you have a dental plus a sigma, the dental just drops out and you're left with a sigma. So it's not really a contraction there, just drops out. And so here you get peso as the final form. So you'd have to remember that this is from patho and not from either peo or peso. You might be tempted to think that this form is present active indicative of peso or something like that, but you have to remember that the dental plus the sigma will cause the dental to drop out. Okay, so that's it for the future active indicative. You'll need to go on and watch the future middle indicative and get to know this paradigm very well. Write it out several times if you need to. Say it out loud, make some flashcards, listen to it, do whatever you need to do to get this paradigm down. And also, do not forget these rules. The rules regarding the tense formative are very important for you to be able to recognize the form when you come across it in your Greek New Testament. So I hope this was helpful. I'll see you next time.